Bonjour, il me fait grand plaisir de vous accueillir à ce webinaire aujourd'hui. Mon nom est Jean-Marc Mangin de Fondation Philanthropic Canada. We'll start in a few minutes. The people are coming in. The webinar will be in English and in French. So if needed, you can access the interpreter on your controls at the bottom of the screen. The session is being recorded so that we can share on our website and YouTube channel. So your face are going to be seen, of course, but anything in the chat will be visible. And if you feel comfortable, I encourage you to please introduce yourself in the chat so everyone gets a sense of who's in the room. We have over 200 people that have registered for this webinar, so there's a large community, great deal of interest. So let your partners know that you're here. So we're going to start with a panel conversation for the first 30 minutes or so, and then we'll move to the question from the audience. We already have received some question during the registration process, but also I encourage you to put any additional question in the Q&A section. So we'll start in about in the 30 seconds a minute to just let other people come in. Donc, bonjour encore une fois, Jean-Marc Mangin de Fondation Philanthropic Canada. Et en tant que président et directeur général de FFBC, j'ai la conviction profonde qu'il est de la première importance de reconnaître les nombreux territoires de l'île de la Tortue où nous vivons tous et de reconnaître la présence et les droits fonciers autochtones inaliénables. Je m'exprime depuis Montréal aujourd'hui, le territoire ancestral des Guéniékéa, qui est depuis longtemps le lieu de rencontre et d'échange de nombreuses communautés autochtones, parmi lesquelles les Guéniékéa, la Confédération Haudenosaunee, les Wendat, les Abenaki et les Anishinaabe. As a settler with Métis ancestry myself, I make it my professional and personal responsibility to better understand the history and legacy of colonialism. Reconciliation requires action, so I strive to ensure my work and that of PFC helps us move together forward to a more just future. On that note, I'd like to introduce our two panelists this morning, or this afternoon, depending where you are across our vast land. You'll notice that both Liban and Lee are experienced practitioners. They are not lawyers. This is on purpose. I value highly the counseling of lawyers from the charity law, but this is about the practice of philanthropy within the context of these new guidelines that will emerge over the course of 2023. So I would like to ask Lee first, and then Liban, just introduce yourself shortly, briefly, and give it a few tidbits about yourselves.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jean-Marc. My name is Lee Burton. I am the Director of Philanthropic Services with MakeWay. For those who don't know who MakeWay is, we are a public foundation and we function as an intermediary in the sector in pursuit of social, environmental, and economic justice. I also hold a master's degree in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership from the School of Public Policy at Carleton University. And I'm also a proud member of the policy committee at PFC, who has been gathering and working through these issues for the last almost 3 years. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. Over to you, Liban.
Hi, thanks, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liban Abokor. I'm one of the co-founders of the Foundation for Black Communities, and I'm currently also a board member with FFBC. I wasn't going to share anything related to academic background, but I will share that I'm a fellow at Carleton University School of Public Policy, only so that I can claim alumniship with Lee, which seems to be a few things that Lee and I have in common. And in my other role, I'm here primarily actually as someone who runs and leads a non-qualified donee as the CEO of Reimagine Labs, a nonprofit organization that supports other social purpose and public sector partners with evidence-based program design. And so I'll really be talking about this, some of our work, so some of this discussion as to how it relates to me both as a NQD, but also as someone who sits on a funder, on the board of a funder like the Foundation for Black Communities, whose constituency is overwhelmingly constituency of non-qualified donees. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Liban and Lee. Donc, comme on le voit avec la participation élevée aujourd'hui, l'intérêt, nous sommes dans un moment clé dans le développement de la philanthropie au Canada. So in the context of the conversation over the DQ, the new DQ regime that got introduced as of January 1st, increasing it from 3.5 to 5%, the PFC, with many others, said, but this is not sufficient. We also need to create the enabling condition for a greater distribution of support within the sector, creating a level playing field between non-qualified donees and charities and to remove that barrier to access to charitable funding. So the law has been adopted to the change income tax in last June, and late November, CRA has issued for public consultation the first draft of its guidelines to assist in the implementation of this new law. You probably have seen in some coverage in the Philanthropic and the Future of Good. There's a great deal of interest in the sector, but also many questions. So hence the purpose of the webinar today. I'm gonna we can get a sense of the level of knowledge amongst the participants today. I'm going to launch a couple of surveys so that we have a basic sense of the conversation is the right level. So you'll see on your screen within a few seconds a couple of surveys coming your way. So Benoit, please. Well, here we go. That's the first question. So the basic. I mean, have you had a chance to read the draft guidelines yet? It's a document of about 30 pages. Would have been great holiday reading, but just have a sense of if you had a chance to read them or not. Please be honest. And if you're a funder, have you ever provided funding to a non-qualified donee? Avez-vous déjà accordé des subventions à des donataires non reconnus? Oui ou non? Donc, on vous invite à répondre à ces deux questions.
I'm a little sad that I can't vote here. It's a big message because I'm not allowed to.
Well, I'm going to still put you on the spot, Lee. You can't answer the survey, but tell me what have been the rules historically, what has changed with the current legislation, and why, so that we have a sense of where we're coming from and where we might be heading.
Sure, I'm happy to, and I'm going to assume that we have a wide range of knowledge in this room, so I'll be general and objective on where we've come from and what this means. As many know, the sector has been regulated through the Income Tax Act, which is overseen by the Canada Revenue Agency. And the CRA is responsible for the use and application of tax-treated dollars in responsible ways. And so since the 1950s, charities have only been able to allocate resources to their own activities. And so that would mean activities that they can run right out of house. And a lot of private foundations don't run their own activities. They typically grant make. So if they are to make allocation of charitable dollars, then it can only go to qualified donees or others who are registered charities. Now, if there's no registered charities that are available to do that work or able to do that work, charities do have another option, which is, well, we don't know how much it's used because it's not tracked separately, but they can give to non-registered service providers and basically commission them to do the work on behalf of the foundation or the charity. And so that means that they must demonstrate direction and control over the work, even though it's a third party that's executing the work itself. It's problematic because it treats community partners as service providers, and it's pretty insensitive to modern approaches to equity. And it also requires rigorous and onerous monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and record keeping. I'm told that a lot of foundations don't do this because they feel it's unnecessarily onerous, it can be paternalistic, and it's quite outdated. So over the last 3 years, there's been some pretty significant strides in updating this piece of regulation that our sector adheres to. And so I see that there's been two basically broad movement tracks, if you will. The first one is broader sector evolution. Many of us will remember in 2019 that the Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector produced a report, and one of their recommendations was that we shift away from this direction and control mechanism for all the reasons that I've just shared. And Senator Ratna Amnabar picked that up and did a landscape assessment with many organizations, many that are here right now today, to understand what were the limitations in moving more dollars, more charitably tax-treated dollars to non-registered charities. And I think some of the things that showed up in that research were that there's quite a bit of inequity around access to the charitable dollars. And also we're balancing inequity and access, and then also accountability. And so that fed into Bill 216, which is the Effective and Accountable Charities Act. And this is meant to increase access for all to charitable dollars, and also maintain accountability to the public for how these charitable dollars are being allocated. And this bill did quite well, unanimously voted through 3 hearings at the Senate and 1 in Parliament. And then it got tabled for the summer. Of course, all those hard workers needed to have a little bit of a summer. And so happening in parallel was the pandemic during all this time. And so the impact of the pandemic, I think, really sped up the thinking around this work. There was pressure put on the federal government to raise the disbursement quota from 3.5 to 5%. And it came out in the budget in 2022 that there would be a raise. And then there was more pressure to say, hey, we really might not be able to make this increase in the disbursement quota if we can't grant to non-qualified donees or non-registered charities. And so there was another change, which is the Budget Implementation Act, and that includes language that shifts us from direction and control, that old antiquated mechanism that we were working with, to what now is qualifying disbursements. That's the new language. And this is really meant to honor the bill of S216 that never made it to the second reading, just basically because of timing. But I don't think there would have been any objections to the bill itself. And so those two things, I think, have led to this place, which probably maybe you could consider this a record time for something like this to move through. And in short, the rules for qualifying disbursement are, you could look at them quite simply, and that's how I'll describe them here, which is a charity may disperse funds to non-charities provided that the disbursement furthers the charitable purpose of that foundation or organization. And the charity needs to adequately document the relationship and justify the alignment between the two entities. So the guidance that came out from the CRA on qualifying disbursements describes a number of different ways that foundations or charities can interpret this language and the accountability tools that they can consider, but they weren't super specific on what exactly it is. And I think that's probably caused a little bit of confusion for those in the sector. And that's what we're talking about today. How do we interpret this guidance and ensure that we're both compliant and accountable, but not being too extractive to our community partners? So in summary, there's the direction and control, which was a very top-down relationship that funders would have with communities. There was no flexibility in how the funding could be used. It had to be very specific, and it treated the grantee as the service provider or an extension of the foundation. And as a result, very rigorous record keeping was needed. And comparing that to now what we have is the qualifying disbursement mechanism, it seeks to create a more flatter, trust-based, collaborative relationship between funders and communities. There's much more flexibility in how the funding can be used. And the resource accountability now is with the foundation. And there's a number of accountability tools that foundations could choose to use out of the suggested framework. So that's my take on everything, but I'd be happy to hear from others on what they think about this.
Lee, thanks a lot for that great overview. I'm going to ask Liban, now that we have this draft guidance, what he likes about them and where are his concerns. But before you start, Liban, just to share the result of the survey for those of you who have missed it. So we do have an experienced audience. Over 60% of the participants have read at least in part the draft guidance, and over 60% of participants have already worked and funded non-qualified donees. So actually, we have a well-experienced audience, and let's set the discussion at that level as well. So Liban, what do you like, and what are your concerns about the draft guidance?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, Lee, you did an incredible job sort of laying out this journey that we've been on as a sector, and really helping us understand where we are. The one thing that I'm going to just sort of put a fine pin on is that these are guidance recommendations right now. They're not set in stone. We have significant opportunity to change some of the things that I'll point out to that I think are could still use some shaping. So we should, I think as a sector, we should really be thinking about how can we level up these guidances so that they become tools that are even more useful to us. And I'll remind us that there is, I'm looking at nearly the names of the folks that are in attendance, and some of them I know, and I'm just thinking about just the incredible diversity of issues that we're all working on, and geographies that we're on, and the demographics that we really sort of focus on in terms of mandate. And I can think about how difficult it will be to find a universal system or tool. And so I would temper us to say I don't think we're going to get everything we want with this qualified this new regulation, and I think that's fine. So I'll sort of start there. To answer some of your immediate questions, I think it's really important for us to maybe just do some ground setting on what an non-qualified donee is, and sort of how this is moving. Because traditionally we think of non-qualified donees as grassroots organizations. We think about them as incorporated nonprofits. We think about them as social enterprises. But there's also this emerging world, frankly, of for-profit companies with social purposes in this evolving social finance marketplace that we have. So frankly, this legislation is going to actually have significant implications, not only in terms of our community service sector, but frankly, our economy as well in the very near future. So I share that to say, even our definition of what we think as non-qualified donees is critical. A few things about the way this is written that currently don't work, and I'm going to try to provide examples that relate to the Foundation for Black Communities, because I think it's really, really important to think about it in ways that make sense for the ultimate the practitioners or the charities themselves. So at the Foundation for Black Communities, so far we've run 2 grant programs. Our grant programs have received almost 800, a little bit over 800 grant engagements or applications. Of that, nearly 95% of those application requests or grant applications were from non-qualified donees. I repeat, nearly 95% of the applications that the Foundation for Black Communities received were from non-qualified donees. This is in many ways very consistent with the Black community writ large. And I'm using the Black community sort of as one example, but I think this in many ways applies to what many founders are, especially those in the youth sector or even some of the art sectors may also experience. So at FFBC, one of the things that we're concerned about this existing regulation is, well, what would it look like if the Foundation for Black Communities becomes a charity? Currently, we're not. We intentionally and purposely operate as a nonprofit organization so that we can de-emphasize some of the regulations that would be applied to us if we were a charity. But our goal is to become a charity, and the concern for us is how can we effectively operate as a charity with these new rules if the administrative burden that stems from the existing regulation and the proposed regulations still exist. And I'll give you an example. The agreements. So in order for a funder to now provide a grant, they have to enter an agreement. The agreement has to, as Lee pointed out, align with your charitable giving. You have to have done due diligence. You have to have some relationship. You have to have some clear terms around how the outcomes of that project will be measured and the use of those and the use of that money. Those last 3 pieces are so significant that the recipient, the non-qualified donee, will actually spend more time trying to administer the operation of the grant than the actual delivery of the services. That alone almost suggests we haven't made as big enough a shift as we might think. And in fact, that will continue to pose a limitation in the nonprofit organizations accessing those services. I'll then use another example of the typical charitable organization in the sector. I've seen lots of money go out from organizations that are really, really small, in part because we have to often cap our administrative overheads. But I was a part of a foundation once on its board, and we had about 2 program staff, 1 administrative support, an executive director, and we were giving them something like $3 to $5 million a year. When you look at that sort of staff structure, I'm not sure how confident I can be that that sort of charitable organization is going to enter into these really restrictive relationships that require significant administrative requirements as either. And so to me, I'm not sure that we've landed on where we want to land to really utilize that increased disbursement that I think many of us should be happy to see. So more money has gone into the sector, but the direction of that capital, if you will, I'm not sure it's been made incredibly easier given some of the existing administrative requirements that exist. And so I have a suggestion. And as you think about those agreements, it would be wonderful if CRA would take an interpretation that looks at the reporting as learning-based evaluation. In other words, it's not that a non-qualified donee has received the capital and then achieved X, Y, and Z, but that funders could feel comfortable that the report can say, here's what we learned in the attempt to deliver said intervention or program. If that were the case, and I think that CRA could signal that that's something that's more permissible, it might remove some of the anxiety that I've heard charities still express in terms of entering into these agreements with non-qualified donees. So those are just some examples of how an organ foundation like an FFBC that is so specifically serving a marketplace that is predominantly non-qualified donees could see this as being continually challenging, how the recipients of the applicants or the grant applicants for that FFBC would typically engage would find it difficult to want to enter into that sort of relationship, given they're not going to have the administrative capacity often. And then also what can be done to remove some of that anxiety. And I think a part of that could be a greater articulation of what the reporting could look like, so that there is more standardization across the sector about what reporting for NQDs, non-qualified donees, could look like, so that small, large, and medium-sized charities and funders aren't so concerned about whether or not they're collecting the right information that could risk and lead to even the perceived threat or risk of revocation. So I'll stop there and welcome any sort of response either from you, Jean-Marc, or Lee.
Thank you, Liban. Again, great practically based set of points you raise. So I get a sense that many of us in the sector are welcoming the opening of this new pathway. That's truly more partnership based as opposed to the directional control that was in place beforehand. That remains as a possibility open to funder. The directional control is not closed, but there's a new pathway now. But there's concern about the administrative burden that the reading of the draft guidance seems to raise. My reading, these are suggestions by CRA for funders and non-qualified donees to engage into. They don't need to be strictly followed. However, there needs to be, you as a funder, you need to make sure that it follows in your charitable purpose, that they are a reasonable, contextually appropriate level of due diligence, and that could be again based on the partner to partner and just clarifying expectations. And there's an agreement in place and some form of reporting that Liban has raised. But reading through the 30-page document, the fear is that that the burden of that seems possibly quite heavy. So we do have this consultation, and there's several points that are being raised in the Q&A that what are the elements that if you had a magic wand, I'm going to put Lee and Liban as a magic wand within the CRA, developing a second set of draft of the guidance. What basic principles need to be in place for these drafts for a guidance to really enable this new pathway to be adopted by the greatest number of charitable partners as possible. So Lee, can I put you on the spot?
Sure. I'll just first say that this document and also the change in legislation is attempting to tackle a lot. And there are so many different players in the sector, as we've already acknowledged, and so many different challenges that are handled in different and unique ways. Representing an intermediary, I can say that it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. So I do understand a lot of the concern that has been raised. We think, though, that this is a good step towards getting more charitable capital to qualified or non-qualified donees, or in our preferred language, equity deserving groups, because non-qualified donees, the range can just, it's such a wide range, right? We have to consider the non-registered actors out there that are contrarian to our worldview as well too, and how this guidance can be interpreted in that way. So in light of that, there's a piece that we would really like to see addressed is around private benefits. So private service providers are included in here, and that can be a train that will be really difficult to reel back down the line, where more charitable capital could be going to service providers that are not in community. They're not they don't have strong relationship in community, but they are maybe chasing a piece of the market. And so it's just something to consider. We'd like to see that modified or taken out. We'd love to talk a little bit more about the gift versus grant. The language that's used here seems to be different than our operating language in the sector. And so if we do put further definition on gift versus grant, I hope that it is in good consultation with practitioners so that this like change in semantics doesn't have a massive operational effect across organizations. And yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there, except to say that the intention of this is to get more capital to equity deserving groups, also in response to COVID-19, but also in general. This model is quite similar to what you can see in the US. And as far as I can tell, and my colleagues can tell, we haven't seen an increase in capital going to equity deserving groups and leaders of color. So, you know, you can change the regulation, but also the worldviews and the practices need to change as well. And so we need to hold ourselves as a community, as a charity community, accountable to that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
to reflect, Liban, to reflect on the last point, this is something that PFC will along with other partners, to track if this new pathway is going to be used or not by members in the community, and see what any stumbling block that may be there that stops partners to using this pathway and moving forward when the final guidance comes out. Liban, do you want to react to what Lee just said?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, a reaction and maybe a response to your question. I don't see a magic wand fix for this legislation. I think we have to see this within the incredible context that Lee initially provided. We're talking about decades of work here, right? I don't think that there's too much consideration for magic wand to occur. There are some existing global macroeconomic considerations around austerity budgets and significant pressure on many different actors within the charitable and social purpose sector to download some responsibility that we probably shouldn't have to solve many of the problems that are emerging. Then there is just, then there's the reality of needing to maintain the existing relationships that we currently have. One of the things that I think we need to acknowledge is that the changes to this regulation increase the accessibility of funding, but they don't necessarily create new entryways. Why? Because many funders have multi-year agreements, right? They're sometimes they're cornerstoning significant segments of our sector, right? Whether it's the education space, healthcare, research, arts. So I think we should be very clear-minded about whether or not this actually just increases accessibility from a semantic standpoint, or whether or not, to Lee's point, it's actually creating direct entry opportunities for those who have historically been outside of our philanthropic charitable sector and actually get attached to these new organizations, or sorry, to foundations. So I'm sort of maybe taking some of the veneer off, so that, because it's not always a policy issue, some of it is a practice thing, like Lee pointed to. But I think we should also be very excited about the speed that this happened, right? This government is really listening. CRA is really listening, and I think maybe not a magic bullet or wand, but maybe an approach is they continue to monitor the number or the percentage of giving that's going to non-qualified donees. Does it actually boost? The initial survey you provided from a staff standpoint is useful. It gives us one data point. That data point is, have you done it before? What it doesn't tell us is, how often have you done it? And have you ever done it again, right? Those are really critical questions that we're going to have to answer. If this now encourages foundations to start doing it once, is this the right regulation to allow foundations to continue doing it? We don't want this to be an opportunity for experimentation. We want this to become normalization, right? We want this to be a normalized experience within our charitable sector. And I think we have to be a bit fair to ourselves and say, that's going to take some time, right? That's going to take the work of PFC, to create those learning opportunities, the knowledge exchanges, the transfer of experience. For example, some of the work that Maggie McDonald at McConnell and Imagine Canada are doing, and the work that is happening at MakeWay. I think it's going to really take us to look at what practices do we create in spite of the regulation that allow us to do this work a bit better. So that's really the frame of mind that I'm coming with this with. I think this gives us a bit more room because it removes some direct constraint, which was the direction and control stick. Mm-hmm. This actually now creates some carrot for better behavior as a sector. So I don't think we have a magic wand, but I think we have tremendously fertile ground to now start operating in. So I look really forward to that next survey in whatever amount of time that says, not only have you done it, but then says, have you done it again? And how confident are you that you can remain doing it? And doing it meaning to investing in non-qualified donors. So I'm really excited about that. But to more finer point, I think the way that we start to generate the requirements for reports will be a significant indicator of whether or not this works. And I'm going to encourage us to start looking at learning-based reporting and not KPIs, like indicators around achievement. If we do that, I think we're going to create a world where we don't acknowledge the 20, 30, 40-year gap that non-qualified donors often have in terms of taking their programs from dealing with some of the most emergent issues that nobody can solve to the kind of areas that we have more scientific, rigorous interventions that can be applied and achieve outcomes. And I say that to say the kinds of applications the Foundation for Black Communities is receiving, there's no way that our $25,000, $30,000 grant, which is very significant, can fundamentally expect that we're going to change those outcomes. But it will have a compounding effect over time if you continue to invest in them. So the reporting has to be learning-based, not KPI-based alone.
Thanks for that, Lee and Liban. So I'm going to integrate some of the questions we're getting from the participants today, but in the context of on the record saying this is a good first draft from a CRA and the agencies about compliance and with the legislation. They are opening a new pathway and providing some tools of what funders and partners should consider in their relationship. But perhaps unwittingly creating some expectations among the administrative burdens and kind of the reality of the work at the ground level. So what should funders or foundations in particular should do in the meantime? Like we have this draft guidance, so we'll get a second draft later in 2023, perhaps the final draft of the guidance, but the law has been in place since June. So what can funders do within the context of the law with the guidance not being finalized? Is any kind of consideration, Lee or Liban?
Are you okay if I get us started there, Liban? Yeah, so I think that it's important for funders to have a look at what their charitable objects are first. Because I'm told that many funders who originated decades and decades ago might not be as familiar with their charitable objects as they'd like to think they are. And sometimes the mission and the grant making can change over time, but those objects remain in place. So go back and have a look, make sure you understand what your objects are. Then also, I would say, have a look at your grant making and determine if opening up your operations to non-registered charity partners is a good idea or not. If it is, if it feels like the right move for you, which I hope it is, then look at the operational changes that might need to happen. In some cases, there might not be any operational changes that need to be happening, but in some cases, there are many. I know, at least for MakeWay, there are operational considerations for us, but engaging in relationship with community partners is what we like to do. That's the approach that we like to take, a very trust-based, let's get to know you, what you're trying to accomplish for within the community that you live in or operate within, and what are we trying to accomplish? How can we support you? How can we show up for you as a partner? And so those things are, that information is something we already capture. We just have never put it in a database before. But we'll be looking at how do we do that? How much information do we need to capture? And where would it need to go? But also ensuring that we're still, to Liban's point earlier, we are taking on the labor of harvesting that knowledge and deepening our relationships with community partners. So yeah, I would say have a look at your objects, decide if granting to non-registered partners is the right step for you, and then really unlearn some of the colonial ways of operating and really challenge yourself to show up differently and build really strong partnerships. Also, you can feed into this process. You can partner with another organization and feed into the CRA guidance, or you can do it on your own. I'm hoping as many diverse voices as possible come to this microphone right now. That's what we need. We don't need always the same voices, which are beautiful voices. We need more. We need many different perspectives. So let's make this what we want it to be. Liban, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm putting myself in the mind of the program manager at that granting foundation, and just what this could mean. If charities now begin to accept that they're going to fund NQDs more readily and generally, you could end up finding a application increase of 10, 15, 20, 30%, right? And so I think it's important that instead of each foundation trying to create a new process, that if there are best practices, we should be sharing them, particularly around the ability to do due diligence. And due diligence in many ways is nothing more than another word for relationship. If we know that the foundation sector writ large has had some frayed relationships with Indigenous and Black communities, as an example, establishing these new relationships isn't going to be an overnight deal, right? And then applying to them the very same due diligence that you might apply to your conventional grant recipient or gift recipient can also pose another challenge. And so I think it's important to reach out to your colleagues in the sector that have been doing NQD work long enough and ask for things like relationships, referrals, recommendations, because one of the greatest resources that we have as a sector are the actual engagements and requests that we receive. So you share those things, right? So, and then make the introduction. I can't tell you the number of times I've gotten a message from a funder who said, Liban, that organization that you've introduced us to, like the relationship is going really great. They would never have heard of us and we would never have heard from them, right? So again, I repeat, just because we now have the ability to do this, if there isn't a relationship between the grant recipient the person who's going to request and the foundation who has a program, it's not really going to lead to the kind of outcomes that we think. So I would say, number one, heed Lee's advice. Think about ways to work together. Number two, the due diligence, try not to make it prohibitive. Try not to create and manufacture ways, edit applicants, because that's what due diligence can sometimes become. It's an exercise of excising versus an exercise of including. And we got to really be cautious about not resorting to that default. Otherwise, when this is all said and done, we might find that the only NQDs that we fund are primarily, and I'm white NQDs or NQDs in urban settings or. And then our NQD grant recipients looks very much like the charitable programs that we often, or qualified donees that we fund. And that would just be a crying shame for all of us. And finally, I think my recommendation, it goes back to the first, invest in your frontline staff. You cannot expect them to process the exact amount of applications, right? The exact same way when the application pool can now be exponentially grown from who can come and make requests of you. So invest in your staff as well. Ensure that they're well supported to start taking on the adjudication of what is assuredly to be a significantly greater amount of grants should you be more willing to support NDQs or NQDs.
I love that. Invest to work in good relation with one another. So great.
So, Liban and Lee, you stressed the iterative relationship and base nature of this partnership, but that would fall within the guidance. So we still have an opportunity to improve the guidance, get the as many voices as Lee has mentioned heard in that process of consultation that ends at the end of the month. Comes very quick. So PFC is launching today a survey with all of our members to see if there's some basic message that we want to send back to CRA to improve the guidance in that sense of being more user friendly, to maintain the space for experimentation, while having some basic places in, like there's an accountability framework that does make sense, and but without being prescriptive, and that agreement in place, and a reporting that could remove the administrative burden, as mentioned, as examples of moving forward. We do have some more detailed questions from the participants today. So let me try to run through some of them.
Jean-Marc?
Yes.
So sorry, my friend.
Yeah.
There's two particular questions that emerged, and I'm mindful of time. Do you mind if we address the one related to should we not fund? Like I think that one's a critical one. If you want to toss that to us, I think that one's probably one that we should not put to bed, but address. It's the elephant in the room.
Well, Liban, go ahead. This is one of the questions, so you jumped the gun, so it's okay. Let's address that one.
So thank you. I'm not going to put homework on folks, but there is this really incredible organization called MakeWay, who can help you figure out how to get dollars to non-qualified donees. There are folks here that I'm looking at through the list. Aldeli, how are you? From Laidlaw Foundation, who have done the work to support the non-qualified donees. I think I saw someone who may be here from Chagnon Foundation. In other words, there are lots of foundations that have have been doing a great job of funding non-qualified donees. So I hope no one walks away from this thinking that there's any true real risk that is any greater than it ever was. And if this survey tells us anything, so many of your colleagues here are already funding non-qualified donees and are doing it just fine. So please don't take any of this as a concern that you shouldn't do it. I think what we're talking about is how to do this better, but I don't think there's a question of whether you can do it. The answer is yes. Whether you should do it, the answer is yes. And if there's ways to do it that meet existing CRA rules, and the answer is yes. And there are people who have done it, and I've given you a few names that I would strongly encourage you to reach out to.
Yes, so good. And I just want to also add to that our colleague Maggie McDonald at McConnell Foundation is working with other foundations to put together a toolkit that will help make this a little bit more accessible for other foundations. We don't have time for Maggie to chat, but I'm sure she would be happy to hear from you.
Great. I'm not on mute. Good. So there's and the events actually several of the questions by your reply, but there's one question that we got from Sylvie Trottier in terms of these gifts, which is a new language in the guidance, count towards disbursement quota for each foundation. The quick answer is yes, but I think she raised some interesting point further, because gifts are supposed to further charitable purpose. Any thoughts about making gifts that are unrestricted, that covers a group operational expense, or do you think that CRA will interpret this only for project-based funding? So gifts as core funding, as a pathway for core funding to non-qualified donees. Do you read this as possible or not possible under the draft guidance?
Well, I'm not an expert in this area, but I certainly hope so. I mean, we have been doing a lot of work as a sector to move away from highly restricted donor defined giving to a place of much more trust. I saw someone in the chat talking about how this is an opportunity to build relationships with partners at maybe even a 5K level or under, and then move into multi-year, more deep trust-based relationships. And so I really hope that this language also will include programmatically aligned, unrestricted funding as well too, because we do need to see more of that. And I think that that's really important to feed into the guidance. MakeWay will be putting together a submission that is informed also by many of our community partners. I see that there are some MakeWay community partners on this call, so reach out if you really want to make sure you want to get some feedback into our submission. But yeah, that's important to put forward. Again, as Liban has mentioned, this is a time for consultation and evaluation and to feed into the process.
Liban?
Yeah, on this particular one, I think it's important to just state I'm not sure I can share an inference, given I don't have the background on that.
No, I mean as long as that all the activities of the non-qualified donees fall within your charitable objects, I do think that even the first draft guidance, set of draft guidance, would allow for unrestricted core funding to happen. And there's that accountability mechanism. There's a learning process attached to it as well. But that it should be possible. My reading of even the first draft of the guidance would make that possible. Can I move to other questions that we have not touched so far? There's one that says, should we hold off on granting to non-qualified donees until the finance guidelines are out, even if it means maybe waiting until the end of the year? I think we partly answered that one, that I believe as long as you are consistent, that you can demonstrate it falls in your charitable objects, that you have some reasonable form of due diligence. And I think the point about reimagining the practice of due diligence is a good one that falls outside of the guidance per se, but there's a practice piece, and that there's some reporting mechanism. There are several foundations that have already, like MakeWay and others, already gone that path, not waiting for the final guidelines to emerge. But we do have an opportunity to shape these guidelines. So again, I'll encourage you to PFC will put a submission in very soon. We have our survey. We want to hear from you, and to get as many voices as possible back to CRA before the end of the month. A question about qualifying disbursement. What makes up the 5% requirements includes both gift to qualified donees and grants to non-qualified donees. Is this right? My understanding, and Lee and Liban, you can correct me, is that yes, it would include both the gifts and the grant to non-qualified donees. There's some new language that's emerging from this guidance, and I think there's going to be some learning to be done about distinguishing what's a gift and what's a grant, qualifying the disbursements, what does it all mean. So we as the guidance is finalized, like whatever new terms becomes the norm, there'll be an element of learning, and PFC will definitely partner with CRA to get this as widely understandable to as many partners as possible to the development of the ecosystem for philanthropy. But it does raise a point that the 30-page document is cumbersome for many. I'm very impressed. Over 60% of this audience has partly read the first draft, but it's not exactly user friendly. That they should be some kind of summary, very practitioner focused summary upfront, 1 or 2 pages, just people know what the basic. The basic framework of the new pathways are, and then if there's needs for more specific examples that people can dwell into an annex. A question from Claire. The directive given stipulations say that organizations jeopardize losing their charitable status for knowingly accepting gift conditional of them going to non-qualified donees. This provision may create risk to the charitable status of charities foundation engaging in partnership with non-qualified donees, and as a result may discourage pool funding partnerships we are in the central way of working now. Can you please comment? Lee or Liban, do you want to comment about pool funding?
Well, I was just going to see, I think Sarah Krasinski of PFC has been keeping her eye on this piece because it was really important that we're not discouraging pooled funding. And from what I understand, the PFC committee feels that this issue has been addressed in this guidance, but I can't go into any detail. Liban or even Jean-Marc, are you able to?
I'll offer Liban a chance to comment first, and I'll go in.
Yeah, Jean-Marc, you know what? As I read that question, I see two parts. I see this as the question asking, or making a statement that it could impact pool funds, but the real question to me was, would this jeopardize would this risk revocation? And is that a reason why we shouldn't be doing this? And my statement to that is, think very carefully and be judicious about the nature of the capital, the assets that you're holding, right? If there are restrictions that have been placed on your receipt of that capital, then ensure that it's being used properly. So in other words, if I have a designated a donor advised fund that says I can only use it for X, Y, and Z purposes, and then I use that for another purpose, certainly that can create challenges. So I would err on the side of caution and just ensure that the purpose of the capital received is always being directed to its appropriate and agreed upon destination. That's my response to, like, color, line twice before you cut. But that would kind of be my advice. If if I understand your question correctly, Claire. And hello, by the way, it's good to see you on the call.
So I'll put my moderators aside again for a second. This is what the pool funding was a nice addition to the draft guidance. It does allow pool funding mechanism within some parameters to occur. There was a concern with the original legislation that it may close that tap. And I think CRA has recognized it as actually good practice in many instances, both domestically and internationally, that funders come together and as long as it falls within their charitable purpose, support to get together a program or sets of partners that deliver. We've seen it during COVID and many communities across the country that pool funding could be a very effective mechanism. And the ability to do it with non-qualified donees with the current guidance is quite promising. It could be clearer, but it's something that I applaud in the draft guidance. There were some question about the kind of the international aspect of the guidance. So let's from Barb, are the risk factors self-assess, or do they have to meet a specific level to have a collaborative relationship with a foreign partner rather than hierarchical? Working with the non-qualified donees, she's mentioning the donee is a registered charity in Mexico in this case. But that language of risk that's prevalent in the current guidance, and especially in the international context, where the kind of definition of risk with the pretty low bars that are in place. I don't know if MakeWay works internationally at all these days, but can you talk about that language of risk and whether or not it would impede potentially impede some of your work with partners outside of Canada?
Well, first of all, I feel like this question is coming from someone who's had to color inside some very clear boxes for a long time and is afraid to go outside of them. And I don't blame anyone for that. It's very, very difficult to give funding outside of Canada. We have done it in the past through a service provider and in that fashion of own activities. It is super onerous, both for the donor and the charity, as well as for the grantee. So we've stopped doing it for that reason, but also our mission is focused in Canada. And so we'll keep our operations here in Canada. My interpretation of CRA's issue, and I could be wrong about this, my interpretation of CRA's issue with granting out of Canada is the own activities rule, certainly, but I think also having tax treated dollars leave the country. I think that there's probably another layer there, although no one's ever said that to me directly. And I think we probably would want someone like Mark Bloomberg or someone else who really keeps their finger on the pulse of international giving to weigh in on this. My hope, and I'm an optimistic person, is that this will reduce the chill and make us a better partner on the international aid landscape, because right now Canada is so detailed in the way that we can participate in pooled funding internationally that I think we're sometimes even not invited to the table for good reason.
Liban, do you want to add?
Yeah, my reading of this is this guideline creates some parameters around risk, but I think it does leave some room for folks to determine what is their risk profile, right? I'm not sure that it's as restrictive as we might be reading into it. We haven't heard that yet, and I think, frankly, one of the things that we were told is some of these things are it's gonna take someone to do it, with good intention, and then to either be corrected and then some sort of statute or case law then created from it, right? So I think I'm not going to say that this is those early days where there's lots of freedom to do things, but I certainly think there's a more permissible environment here than we might than we might be letting ourselves accept. And so to attach this to Claire's question on pooled grants, the existing grant guidelines, the guidelines that we have here are pretty descriptive on what you would need to do in order for you to make a pooled fund contribution. They're not that obstructive, right? You make sure that you identify how much you're contributing, what your role is going to be. An agreement is between all parties. You've done they're not incredibly restrictive. The challenge is it places the grant maker in the same place to have to get aligned with other actors that the NQDs have historically had to be in. And what you're running from is the administrative responsibility that non-qualified donees have historically wanted to find themselves in. It's a very sweet irony, right? That if we accept that pool funding is difficult to do, coordinate, orchestrate, then can you imagine how difficult it is for a non-qualified donee who's seeking grants from a universe of grantees to then have to deal with all of you individually? And then frankly, then in each one of you, maybe inadvertently directing them to do something that could jeopardize the agreement that they have with another. So I think we should actually be leaning into pooled grant opportunities and see the space for them as far more permissible rather than restrictive. And I was actually a little bit surprised about the language in this in the suggested guidelines. I think they're a little bit more, as I said, permissive than we think. But that said, please pursue seeking legal advice from experts. I'm simply sharing our what we've heard back from our own sort of counsel, but would recommend that we continue to have these conversations as the answers will likely become clearer as an outcome of the practice, and then us being told, sorry, you've gone too far, or we're heading in the right direction.
Can I add to that? And there's some great comments coming up in the chat here about this, which is like, let's stay engaged, let's collaborate, let's share our learnings along the way, let's be transparent about how we're approaching gifts versus grants. Maybe it's a policy that's on your website that is iterative. We don't want anyone trying to go it alone, you know, especially organizations with smaller operating budgets. I think this is giving the sector a little bit more of an opportunity to self-regulate. Of course, there are challenges that come along with that, but I think we're used to being responsive to the box that's created for us. And I think now we're getting a little bit more flexibility to interpret and to engage in new ways with new partners, and we should take it. And get a lawyer also. Liban is very wise.
Although the purpose of this is not to give additional work to legal advisors, is to allow open space for good practice to emerge, and that I would echo on both your point, Liban, and these are not prescriptive. These are what funders should consider and might want to consider in their relationship with their partners, domestically and internationally. Coming from, I spent 25 years in the international development humanitarian world, I echo your point, Lee, that because of the past regulation before this big change, we were not even invited to the table around pool funding arrangements. But I'm still concerned about the language about risk. That it will be perceived as the threshold is so low that it'll be perceived as barriers. For example, this language about high or low risk countries, high or low risk level of investments, they're very contextual. You can have a large funding in the country that's in the midst of civil strife. But if all the partners agree that all the stakeholders in that context agree that this program is worthwhile, I'm thinking especially of some early childhood programs, it's still possible to operate in some of the most difficult contexts in the world. And then if you do a program, I'll take the Dominican Republic, for example. It's considered a fairly stable country, but if you try to work with Asian migrants in Dominican Republic, this is a very high risk program, and still worthwhile doing, assuming that you get a strong relationship in place. But so you could have a low risk program in a high risk country, or vice versa, and I think that language does not provide that contextual understanding by providing this table. I think it's more confusing than enabling for many. But having said that, it is not a prescriptive tool. It's even in the current guidelines. It's something for partners to consider in their relationship. My understanding is that the Income Tax Act, that any grant of $5,000 or more must be registered. That's the law of the land. So that will have to remain in place until the law is changed. So that's the element that, but it does not mean that a $5,000 or $25,000 is necessarily high risk investment. To make change, the level of investments are much greater, but by itself, it's not an additional element of risk per se to do more granting that's more than 25,000. Lee.
I can comment on that just from the MakeWay perspective of how we're sort of looking at what you just described there around risk, levels of risk with different gift or grant categories or levels. This isn't final at all. It's just a concept that we're noodling around, where contributions, allocations, if you will, under 5,000, they can have basically the basic amount of documented information and qualification activities, I guess, if you will. And then maybe there's another tier, which is sort of standard level risk. We're going to make sure we document X, Y, and Z based on what we already know about our relationships. And then there's the higher giving tier, maybe something, I'm going to guess just 50,000 above. I don't know. It's arbitrary right now, but that's where we go a little bit deeper. That's where we have a little bit more diligence. And we would do that anyway, but it's just about documenting it at this stage. So we're not trying to make to create really heavy operations for every single contribution that goes at the door.
Liban?
The Foundation for Black Communities is by mandate focused explicitly on investing in Black communities here in Canada for the time being. But naturally, there is tremendous concern for us on the well-being and regard of African diaspora communities in the Caribbean and South America and on the continent. So we're very interested on this question of how to get more resources abroad and what are the best ways to do it. And as I listen to this conversation, I just think about the wealth of knowledge that exists on those who are already doing it. And I'm just going to go back and like just strongly urge us to, if you feel timid, if you feel like you want to do more learning, there are folks who have significant experience. I repeat again, 66% was it? Or 60+% of folks who've invested in non-qualified donees. I think that's going to be really, really, really critical to go and check in with those folks. And when it comes to the issue of risk, I think that's probably another thing that we want to move a little bit away from and not make that as pronounced. The word risk seemed a little bit like the boogeyman in this document. It was you the first time I recognized Jean-Marc who brought it to my attention. It's over 50 times, 60 times it's noted.
60 times.
And but yet it's poorly defined. It categorizes areas that can be resolved with just some judicious thinking as risk. I'll give you an example. If you're a new organization created who has never received funding before, and you receive anything over a certain amount of money, you should be considered a risk. And I think and the number is quite small, it's even as $25,000. And I think to myself, well, think about how many communities that describes across this country, right? Even just in Canada, who are trying to solve a problem that they've now been emboldened to, whether it's university students or parents or a group of folks. So I'm just a little bit worried that we've created an environment possibly of fear by utilizing that word so prominently, when in reality it's that risk should really be maybe rephrased as just not yet defined, like be thoughtful, be conscientious, right? But I am hopeful on that pool funds will take root. I'm hopeful that more dollars can get to the communities that we care about. And I think Canada should be concerned about this, particularly because our own local economic, cultural, and even environmental well-being is so closely tied to what's happening in the globe. For this isn't intended to be a crazy aside, but Canada is about to recruit nearly 500,000 immigrants a year for the next number of years, right? The quality, the availability, where those immigrants come from will be determined by the stabilization, safety, and security of those regions, right? And so there's a direct correlation between us wanting to invest abroad, not out of altruism, but frankly, if I could also just put it, out of our own social, economic, cultural well-being in this country, right? So I think we need to be thinking about investing in those communities more readily and thinking about how this permits that, because ultimately those communities also invest in us through immigration. And we see that. The pandemic saw that, our universities took a hit when university students weren't here. Our ability to trade is impacted when there isn't proper education, healthcare available and accessible in different regions of the world. So again, I think we should be taking a less NIMBYism view and seeing that investing abroad actually has tremendous benefits right here in our own backyard.
And thank you, Liban. Also, our friend Jonas Hassan as well too has pointed out to me that it's also a social civic responsibility, being consumers and climate emitters who are not directly impacted in ways that other countries are by climate change.
Yeah, and according to the data that we track, less than 8% of total foundation granting goes for international causes. So a really small part, and a good chunk of that is the MasterCard Foundation itself. If I can shift, there's a couple of questions about foundation charitable objects that many are restricted to grant only to qualified donees. Does it mean that you have to change their that each one of them will need to change their objects, or can there be some kind of ruling that allows foundation that do want to support non-qualified donees that falls within their broad charitable objects that they can do so? They have it's almost a legalese question, but I'll still ask you, Lee and Liban, to your thoughts about that issue, that many donors are restricted to granting to qualified donees only.
I think that's something that needs to come out front and center at the top of the feedback to this consultation process. It's critical, and I don't think we have a way of extracting any data to know how many foundations have. Well, I guess we could take a very creative approach to looking at all the objects that include qualified donees. But yes, this could affect a lot of institutions here. I think it's our chance to feed in. Yvonne, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yes. So I mean, my immediate thought is change it absolutely. Policy informs practice, and as long as that's there, it could create a regression to us only funding qualified donees. So remove it. It's not necessary. It really has never been necessary. You could have always just naturally kept only funding qualified donees, but it certainly would inform better practice or encourage the better practice of funding non-qualified donees if that isn't there. And now the question is, if you have that as a current requirement, does that limit your ability to engage? I don't know that. I don't have that answer yet, but it's an important question for us to look at. And hopefully there are folks here who, once they've answered that, can share it. I know this really good membership network called PFC that I'm sure can help you get that information out once you've determined. But we really, if the question isn't about how we should change it, if the question is should we, and the resounding answer from my standpoint is get rid of it. It prejudices against funding emergent organizations that are doing, not only emergent, but established organizations that are doing good work in our communities. It's been an unnecessary constraint in our mind that has fueled the ability to get capital to the organizations that need it when they need it. And we've seen what it's come out to. We have the Indigenous reports, we have the lack of Black funding reports. So get rid of it. The question to me is two parts. Should we do it? Yes. How we do it? TBD.
Thanks. So Liban, you referred to PFC already. So we already raised this issue of charities that are restricted to support qualified donees only with CRA. It's my hope that the CRA will not require thousands of charities to amend the objects, and that's something we'll continue to raise with CRA, and that's all part of our forthcoming submission. We're coming to the end of our of a session, but I'm going to invite both you, Liban and Lee, to give us your final thoughts about what next and your hope for the sector. Liban?
Lee, can I give you the final word?
Oh, you want to do the final word? Okay, great.
No, I'll give you the final word. Plus, I don't want to have to follow whatever amazing thing you're going to say. So I'm going to encourage us to really lean in on this regulation, even if it doesn't get changed. as being an incredibly fertile ground that creates tons of permissibility for us to do things in new ways. I don't want any of us to be afraid, if we haven't done it before, from reaching out to, you know, our friends. And this is a sector of friendship. I mean, I think about the Foundation for Black Communities and the incredible progress that we've made in 2.5 years. And none of that would have been possible if we weren't leaning on the folks in this sector. I can't remember a single time where we've asked a question where someone hasn't gone out of their way to find it, even if it wasn't resting with them. So, and you know that, so I'm just reminding us, like, there's lots of places to get information you need about how to do this thing right. And then finally, I'm going to just share a quick story on my own. I have been, for the last 15 years, leading non-qualified donees, specifically serving Black communities. And this has been one of those shining moments that we've long imagined. What would it mean if foundations were no longer telling us that they could not fund us? What could we achieve? And I'm telling you, the hope in community that this becomes a broad in practice is incredible. The opportunity to invest in really remarkable and impactful things is right there for our taking. And I've seen the incredible demand for us to get direction and change, direction and control changed. And I think I hope it doesn't take a similar Herculean effort for us to start adopting what this allows us to do. So my key takeaway is, if you want to do it, there are folks who know how to do it. Please reach out. And there's a whole community. This is the practitioner, but there are literally millions of Canadians who would be so well served if we started funding non-qualified donees, because those are often the only actors and players in those communities. And we need to stop erasing them because of our constraints of support. We no longer have that here, and we can do so much more if we lean in. So see this as more permissible than something that is restrictive.
Liban, I wish you were going last. That was so beautiful and inspiring too. And I agree with you as well. Let's look at this as an advancement in our sector, as an enabling concept that we all get to feed into. I've been in the sector for about 15 years, and I've seen a massive change in how we operate. And I'm really proud of that. And I see a lot more collaboration. I see a lot more diversity of voices and perspectives that are coming to the table. And this is our sector. We're getting an opportunity to sort of shape where we go from here. And it's just really important for us to take that opportunity, in my opinion. And yes, I would say, on a personal note, someone told me one time when I joined the sector in Canada, I just moved from South Korea at the time, and they were joking about how there's no such thing as a philanthropic emergency. That really stuck with me, because I thought, it kind of seems like there is. And I think that the evidence in the last 2 years from the COVID-19 pandemic has brought forward an emergency that was always there, an emergency of equity and justice and accountability. So I stand with you also, Liban. I would love to see more capital going to groups that are advancing equity and justice in their communities, for them to be able to self-determine pathway forward. It would be nice to see us navigate towards a sector that is where philanthropy is no longer needed. So let's do that together.
Je voudrais vous remercier, Lily et Liban, pour vos perspectives aujourd'hui. C'est très, très riche comme conversation. So next step. So there's this iterative practice base of learning to take advantage of these new pathways. But first and foremost, improve the guidance, the draft guidance. We need to hear from you. So we have the survey. We have a quick turnaround. We need your input by Friday. Donc, je vous encourage de répondre au sondage d'ici vendredi pour nous permettre de finaliser le document qu'on va partager avec tous nos partenaires et nos membres avant la fin du mois pour répondre à l'échéancier du 31 janvier. Sur un autre point pour les membres de FPC, il y a la retraite des PDG, le CEO Retreat. in Banff this year, May 1st to 3rd, and this I'm sure is going to be one of the core issues that we're going to be discussing at Banff. So if we only have 30 spots, and most of them are already taken. So if you're interested, please let us know and register. We're launching a few new affinity groups, including a communication affinity group, possibly one on in the space of affordable housing, one in the space of art funding, another one on aging. So there's a lot of activities on a lot of thematic issues within the PFC network. And if you're not a PFC member, I encourage you to get in touch and be engaged in us to be able to develop the ecosystem for more effective and meaningful philanthropy in Canada. So on that note, je veux encore like to thank Lee and Liban for your very rich perspective today, and to encourage everybody to stay engaged and let's continue to develop the field. Donc, merci et bonne journée à tous. Au revoir.